Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. I'm Nick. I'm here to talk about UI. And so a little bit about my background. In general, I think of design as a way to stitch elements together and keep what works, get rid of what doesn't, and create new experiences. My background is in print and web. That's kind of like my foundation in a kind of agency, full service agency background. And then I got into disruptive tech when I moved to San Francisco and started working at BitTorrent, actually right across the street. This used to be a parking lot, so that was kind of funny. But then I got into user-generated content when I worked at Wikia, now known as Fandom. And then got the opportunity to join AltSpace VR at the very beginning and developed a social VR network and developed the UI system for that. And then that actually, it's been announced that AltSpace was actually acquired by Microsoft recently. And so since then, I've moved on to Meta, where I'm focused on head-mounted AR. And so at Meta, we're figuring out new ways to interact with computers. And our interactions are hand-based, and you reach out and touch holograms and manipulate them. And it's all really very interesting so far. I've been there for about a month. I'm not talking about Meta or head-mounted AR. I'm going to talk about my experience at AltSpace VR. And so AltSpace is a VR social network that allows you to connect online with other people in a virtual environment. You can make friends, connect as friends, attend events, play games, etc. There's a really vibrant community in AltSpace, which is why Microsoft bought it. Some of the biggest events in VR have taken place in AltSpace. This is Reggie Watts performing to an audience. And we also had we still have a mobile UI that allows people to connect with their social network on the mobile device and kind of like bridges the gap and is a very good kind of example of mobile a mobile VR design system. So we had to have a UI that worked for in these different ways. And so, with everything, it's like the biggest thing here, I mean, we're learning all these details, and there's a bunch of technology that you have to wrap your brain around, and it's like really complicated and can be kind of intimidating to get started. But the basic idea is that all the basic principles are true. So if you can design for the real world and you're out there doing stuff, or you have a passion for signage or wayfinding systems and all that kind of stuff, you can design for VR. You just have to kind of like map that into the tool set that exists right now, which is rapidly changing. And so there's a few areas where, take this advice if you can. Context, control, and comfort. These are areas where I think it's like, there's some ideas that I have observed and maybe some patterns that are emerging that I want to share. So the first is context. So proximity implies relationship. So in VR, the user's distance to an object can be one of the simplest ways to show meaning. So from a side view, if you're standing in front of objects, the way that the meaning of the object or how you want to interact with the object may change depending on how close or far you are from that. It's like kind of basic, kind of obvious, but it's like if you're close enough to pick up an object and you have the ability to do that in the system, which we'll get into later, maybe you're going to highlight it in a certain way that allows you to pick up the object. If you're further away, maybe you need to, you don't have that affordance. You can't pick up the object from further away. In the real world, you can't really change the design of the object per se for that instance. And so you might want to highlight some signage by the object that's encouraging you to pick it up or encouraging you to get closer so that you can pick it up. Further away, maybe it's like a basic signage that's just, among other things that you're looking at, and you may want to just indicate that something is there. And so that's just a very simple example. Also in social settings, you're standing in front of people and you're at a certain comfortable distance. Maybe there's metadata associated with them. And if somebody gets in your face, it can be very uncomfortable, and that's another aspect. Maybe you want features that prevent people from getting in your personal space. So in some ways, I've found that it's helpful to set up breakpoints. So similar to like mobile first design, it's like in VR, it's about a three-dimensional space. So you want to basically define regions, what I like to call distance breakpoints, which have to do with you're going to set up the meaning. So in a social VR setting, you might establish that between like 3 meters, and this is something that you just develop in the process, but it's like 0.3 meters is personal space. 1 to 3 meters could be conversational. And then beyond that is like peripheral, in the sense that like, you might want information or metadata about something, but you don't necessarily want to interact with it. And so in AltSpace, this is like an early prototype of the name tag. We don't allow people to get in your personal space. They actually disappear if that happens. And then if people get close enough for you to talk, you can friend them, so the friending icon appears. And people that are further away in that peripheral zone are you can't friend them, because we didn't want people to like spam friends from across the room. And so it's just an example. Also, there's layout issues to where if you're further than this peripheral distance, or you're the person who's furthest away basically their name tag doesn't shrink down all the way, so that it's like it remains legible. So it's like legibility and meaning kind of have to do with this. So use distance to show meaning, and you can set up distance breakpoints to help do that. The next thing is control. So the control systems in VR are very complicated, but that doesn't mean that the interactions have to be complicated, especially the most basic interactions. So the number one thing is show people what they can do. It's like, it's pretty standard in like a design system. I mean, the web does this with the little pointer icon and the hand icon when you click over a link or something like that. But in VR, I think it's even more important. And so one of the things to understand here is that there's kind of, the control system is a little bit, is interesting. It's basically between cursors and hands. And so that's kind of the spectrum. And so like we've been in the current paradigm of mobile and mobile adoption over the last 10 years or so has been about kind of cursors and touch. But VR, it's about cursors and hands. And so gaze input is it's the most widely used VR input. It's the easiest. There's no controller required. It's basically when you have like, you point at something and you use your head to move. It's like having a laser pointer glued to your forehead. And you basically use some sort of button to click or tap. And sometimes there's even like a timer on the icon or the cursor to let you know when it's going to select. And then 3DOF, which DOF, that's a term, degrees of freedom. It's basically tracking rotation only. So it's like if your arms are locked in place and you have a laser pointer and you can point at things. And so that's a point and click model that makes sense as well. But when you attach physics to it, you can do some pretty cool things. And I think it's actually a pretty simple and interesting alternative. And a lot of the simpler systems, like the mobile systems and the untethered systems that are coming out, are utilizing this kind of control scheme. And then finally, there's 6DOF, which is tracking both rotation as well as position. And so here, it's like your hands are tracked in space. So this is by far the most interesting way to interact with virtual objects. You can reach out and grab objects. It's definitely the most immersive type of experience where you're just in the experience, your hand becomes a tool, or you can see your hands and you can interact with objects. But it's also the most complex because we don't really have standards about interacting with objects with your hands. I think, we're gonna see a talk about that later, but essentially, point and click also works in this model too, because you can track rotation, you can have a laser pointer in your hand, even if you have 6DOF controllers. So it's still the lowest common denominator, and you want to have an interface when you're showing menus and stuff like that uses point and click. And so using the cursor to indicate what happens next is a good way to do that. In alt space, the cursor kind of changes when you're doing different things, like when you're moving around, the cursor becomes this circle with the arrow. When you are clicking on or hovering over a UI element, the cursor changes into this arrow. And then when you're interacting with a in-world object, it becomes a target. And so by no means is this like some sort of complete list of things that, an icon, a cursor can be, but it's like letting people know kind of what's next is important. And then also just in terms of hover states being very obvious, it's like make sure that stuff is large and very easy to select. And so, thick borders, bright colors, round objects are comfortable to select. They're kind of easier to select. It's also good if you make the target area like oversized, because especially on that gaze cursor model, it's like if you are trying to select something with a laser pointer that's glued to your forehead, it's like you're probably not going to be that accurate. So just like a forgiving system is good. Also, menus that switch into other things. So if you have a confirmation dialog, try to figure out a way to like integrate that into the menu system that is in line in position, because in traditional like desktop design, you have like modal windows that pop over to do confirm dialogues and stuff, but that's actually very uncomfortable to move your head around in that way. So it's menus that switch contexts are kind of interesting. And ways to kind of group things together is another thing, kind of way to handle that. And so basically point and click, still a thing. Use the cursor to provide hints, and you want to make buttons and targets big, bold, and round. So the final aspect of this would be comfort. And so there's a lot of stuff about that. I mean, literally, like bad design can make somebody sick. So it's like really important to keep the experience as comfortable as you can. And one aspect of this would be that space and the amount of space in a 360 environment does not mean that you have unlimited content or unlimited opportunity to shove as much content as you can. If you try to do the stuff that you do on desktop, which is like rectangular layouts, logos, and menus and stuff kind of slammed into the corners, you know, if you just port that straight into VR, it doesn't really work. It's like pretty uncomfortable. It's like if you're having to move your head, traverse the screen, like that's pretty annoying and can get tiring. It also doesn't really make sense because you have objects that are like in the corners, but there is no corner because it's like a round kind of central focus that you're looking at. And so one thing that kind of I found works is if you take content, the amount of content that you would have on a mobile device, and you port it to VR and maybe change the proportions, center the elements, but use about that much content, it's a little bit more comfortable. Obviously, this diagram is not to scale, so this is just a tip. It's just an idea. And you know, in general, it's like centered layouts that have objects that are grouped together. I think are a little bit more comfortable and aesthetically pleasing when you're in VR because you have no bounding box of the elements that you're looking at. And so if it's too much for a mobile screen, it's probably too much for a 360 scene. So this is an early prototype of the friending system, and so basically we were just trying to figure out how much information was comfortable for people to read, and we ended up with something in the middle here, which is like very similar to what we would have on mobile, and that I think that was insightful, and it would actually allowed us to have like a pretty decent mobile first strategy where like a lot of the menus and stuff that you see in AltSpace are also stuff that we have straight ported into the mobile app. And then also this emergent pattern of like menus and dialogues and the things like the close button or the back button being centered and on the bottom of the element is something I've seen a lot lately, and you know, it's something that we were experimenting with, and it's felt comfortable to us when we were developing it, and it seems to like have become a thing. So keep, you know, no more info than you would show on mobile. Centered layouts work best, and be aware of head movement. I think that's like one of the biggest things. So final thoughts here. Most of the same rules apply. If you can design for the real world, then you can totally design for VR. You just have to think about everything in a way that you would think about it if it was a room that you're designing. Proximity implies relationships. So along those same lines, you can think about the room, but you can also think about it in terms of dynamic elements that appear when you get near an object or when you're further away from something. And you can control the legibility factors when you actually set those rules for different distances. Showing users what you can do means make affordances clear, make systems that tell you what's going to happen next, which means cursor states really apply to that, as well as hover states. More space does not equal more content. You want to keep basically like the amount of stuff you would show on mobile, and experiment with the way that you present that so it's comfortable to look at. And keep doing crazy shit. Like, you know, it's like, there's all these, you know, kind of prescriptive rules that people like me are trying to set up, but, you know, those are based on emergent patterns that I think work, and I've learned through some experience. But, you know, for the most part, it's like there are new ways of interacting with things, and you know, everybody here who's interested in designing for VR, this is an opportunity to invent new things, leverage patterns that you see, create new patterns. The stuff that works the best will continue to continue to be adopted by people, and users will let us know what works and what doesn't. So experiment with different kinds of stuff, and there's tons of opportunity to do that. So that's it for me right now. I actually have the content of this talk I have on my blog. So if you go to nickcottrell.info/ideas, it's like I have an article that kind of goes over all this content. And hit me up on Twitter with any questions or anything. And that's it. Thanks. Cool.
Do you use anything in your tool set that is somehow connected to web design, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript?
Yes.
Can it be translated like from web design into VR space? Is there a chance that we'll keep on using the same techniques and same tools in VR, or it will be something new?
Well, an interesting aspect of that would be like some of the stuff that's happening with web VR is super cool and interesting if you're a web developer and you know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. A-frame is like a great thing to experiment with, and that's gaining traction, and a lot of platforms are starting to use that. I was doing some stuff where I was experimenting and prototyping in A-frame because while I was at AltSpace, because our SDK supported A-frame. So I would create menus and bring them into AltSpace, and we can talk about them in a social VR environment. So it was a great way to prototype. It's like very much in its like infancy right now in terms of like there's no way to make a link or something like simple like that. You have to like write the JavaScript to like assign event handlers to do the most basic stuff, but it's something that's rapidly developing, and every time I hear of a new like browser update for A-frame, it's like really exciting because they're kind of clearing up a lot of the issues that are like pretty basic. So yeah, I mean that's super awesome.
Question here.
Yeah.
I'm going to walk here, so I want. Hello, good evening, and thank you for giving the talk, Nick. So I just want to say that all of the ideas that you said, they're basically things that people do in video game design, but you're able to articulate them very well. So cool, you gave me words to describe what I need to say to people. The question I have is basically, do you find that it helps or hurts people who are trying to go into VR if they have a background in making video games, especially like first-person shooter or first-person view type games? Thank you, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's interesting. I mean, just coming into this industry from like a more traditional product design background, it's definitely very apparent that a lot of the people who have been involved thus far have come from games, and people that I've worked with are extremely knowledgeable about a lot of this stuff. It's like very much a natural part of the process to account for affordances at different distances and think in 3D and stuff. I think what's interesting is that like if you've only like there's a learning curve for people who, it seems like I should say I've observed that there is a learning curve for people who have a games background, because a lot of the next gen console gaming that's happening now doesn't have to account for the same types of performance considerations as Laura outlined earlier. And so that can have a pretty big effect on like what you're actually trying to do and how you're going to do it. And so I think that's something to consider if you do have a games background, that like fundamentally you want to think a little bit more about how the performance of the graphics and the timing of stuff works. And so, yeah. And then there's a lot of stuff like in traditional design that and usability of systems that, especially of productivity systems that, everything is not a game. So it's like, when you're using Unity and stuff, there's a lot of stuff, even like a standard, like basic unit in Unity is like a game object. And it's like, you could be designing a very serious like productivity tool or something, and it can be a little bit confusing to navigate the tool set. And it will be great when there's kind of like a next generation game engine for mixed reality. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a thing. Is that it? All right, thank you.